Call you this liberty? Call you this a free republic where 4 million are subjects but not citizens? Thaddeus Stevens.
Oh, hi. Mr. Lahasky here. And today, we begin to pick up the pieces. General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, ended the Civil War. But the country was no less divided on April 10th than it had been 4 years prior when the first shells fell on Fort Sumter. Now, under normal circumstances, wars end with treaties, which dictate terms that are agreed upon by both sides. Treaties usually provide a way forward, a framework that will allow the two sides to coexist. But as we learned, Lincoln never considered the Confederacy a warring nation, so there could be no treaty, only surrender. This left so many questions yet unanswered at the end of the war. What was to become of the states that seceded? What was to become of the Confederate political and military leaders who had orchestrated the rebellion? And what was to become of the 4 million people who had been freed from bondage by the 13th Amendment? Today, we'll begin to sort through it all. But first, a big question. Was Reconstruction policy radical or conciliatory? Your average American history textbook identifies the Reconstruction period as 1865 to 1877. This, of course, is slightly misleading since many unresolved issues of the Civil War remain with us today. But during those 12 years, the nation focused its energies and attention on rebuilding the South and reincorporating the Southern states into their normal relationship with the Union. But as is often the case, Americans disagreed as to the best way to do this. The debate divided the Republican Party, and a tug-of-war ensued between a Congress that was hell-bent on imposing heavy controls on the postbellum South and a president who favored leniency and reconciliation. Elements of both found their way into federal policy, but which approach ultimately prevailed? And was it successful? Let's take a look. So the story of Reconstruction actually begins before the war even ended. And this makes sense. Abraham Lincoln and his Congress did not know when the war would end, but it was going to end eventually, and they hoped that that end would bring the restoration of the Union. Accordingly, they began discussing Reconstruction plans as early as 1862. But these conversations were shaped by a growing divide in Northern politics. This is our first big idea. During the Civil War, the Republican Party divided into moderate and radical factions, causing disagreements over Reconstruction policy and friction between Congress and the President. In the absence of the Southern states, Congress during the war was controlled by the Republican Party. But not all Republicans were created equal. Or I should say, not all Republicans believed in equality. The Republican Party of the early 1860s had two major factions, moderates and radicals. Moderate Republicans wanted the Union restored at any cost, but they did not necessarily believe in racial equality. Many opposed voting rights for African Americans, and some believed that whites and blacks could never coexist in the United States. Moderate Republicans wanted to put the war behind them quickly and favored a swift and painless process to readmit seceded states back into the Union. Opposing these moderate views were radical Republicans. The radicals were led by Pennsylvania Representative Thaddeus Stevens. Radical Republicans did believe in racial equality, and they envisioned fundamental changes in Southern society after the war. Changes that would empower freed blacks through universal voting rights and the redistribution of Southern wealth. The radicals wanted white Southerners to pay for their role in the rebellion and favored strict requirements for Southern states as a prerequisite to their restoration. Now, by the end of the war, President Lincoln supported some of the policies favored by radical Republicans, but early on, he was a moderate. Lincoln wanted slavery ended and the Union restored, but was unsure about social equality. As late as 1863, Lincoln even favored a nonsensical and frankly racist measure that would have deported freed slaves to Africa. Lincoln's first plan for Reconstruction, introduced in December 1863, also reflected this moderation. His plan, known as the 10% Plan, would have allowed a Southern state to rejoin the Union after only 10% of its population had sworn an oath of future loyalty to the United States. A seceded state would also have to accept emancipation in a new state constitution, but barring that, there were no other requirements. Furthermore, Lincoln proposed amnesty for former Confederates who swore allegiance to the Union. Lincoln hoped that his lenient plan for Reconstruction might help to bring a quicker end to the war by offering a manageable path forward for the South, but the plan was unpopular with radical Republicans in Congress, so it never took root. The radical Republicans proposed a plan of their own in 1864, the Wade-Davis Bill. The bill held that a Southern state could only regain its voting privileges in Congress after 50% of the state's population had sworn a so-called ironclad oath, saying that they would be loyal to the Union and that they had never aided or supported the Confederacy. This ruled out anyone who served in the Confederate Army, merchants and farmers who sold food and supplies to the Confederate government, and all holders of political office. In many Southern states, this threshold was simply implausible. It would have taken years, if not decades, before the South could fully comply. The Wade-Davis Bill also held that former Confederates were banned from voting or holding office, which contrasted with the offer of amnesty that Lincoln favored. The Wade-Davis Bill passed both houses of Congress, but Lincoln vetoed it, fearing that the harsh restrictions would only make the South fight longer and harder. So neither Lincoln's moderate 10% plan nor the radicals' Wade-Davis Bill actually went into effect, but together they demonstrate the different approaches favored by each faction. They also set up a potential post-war showdown between Congress and the president over who would control Reconstruction policy. But only days after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, a tragedy in Washington irrevocably changed the course of Reconstruction in America. This is our second big idea. Lincoln's assassination left the country in the hands of Andrew Johnson, a conservative Southerner who lacked the political acumen of Lincoln and the respect of the radical Republicans in Congress. 6 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. His killer, John Wilkes Booth, was a Confederate sympathizer outraged by the 13th Amendment and the results of the war. His attack was part of a broader plot to kill the top 3 U.S. government officials, the President, the Vice President, and the Secretary of State, in hopes that the South would revive its struggle in the ensuing chaos. Of the 3 assassins, only Booth was successful, and while the Confederacy did not rise as Booth had hoped, it's hard to overstate the ramifications of his crime. Lincoln's death had 2 major effects that complicated post-war Reconstruction efforts. First, Vice President Andrew Johnson took over as president. Johnson was a Southerner from Tennessee who was actually a Democrat before the war. Lincoln had asked Johnson to be his running mate for the 1864 election in order to balance the ticket and appeal to more Northern Democrats. But while Johnson may have been the perfect person to help Lincoln win re-election, he was not perfect for the presidency. While Lincoln was a capable politician, Johnson was not. Republicans in Congress neither trusted nor respected him, and Johnson proved utterly unable to win them over. And this struggle between congressional Republicans and President Johnson was complicated further between the second major effect of Lincoln's assassination, the rise of the radical Republicans. Lincoln's death rendered him a martyr for the Union cause and the end of slavery. And as the nation's people grieved, they looked in anger for someone or something to blame. The fierce anti-Southern rhetoric of radical Republicans resonated with these voters. And in the 1866 midterms, radical Republican candidates did extremely well, achieving a majority in both houses of Congress. This widened the gap between the conservative president and Congress, making the struggle over Reconstruction even more contentious. Now, beyond the tragedy of Lincoln's death, the country was in shambles, and action was desperately needed. The first phase of Reconstruction was implemented by President Johnson, and it's outlined in our third big idea. Upon assuming the presidency, Andrew Johnson went to work dismantling Lincoln's early efforts and forging a lenient path towards Reconstruction. While true that Abraham Lincoln was generally seen as a moderate Republican leader, by the end of the war, he was on board with a number of radical Reconstruction policies. His 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the Union, and Lincoln even expressed tacit support for black voting rights. Then, in January 1865, he authorized a massive land redistribution effort through the Army. General William T. Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15 designated more than 400,000 acres of land seized from white Confederates for distribution to the newly freed black populations in the South. This was the famous promise of 40 acres and a mule that would have provided an economic foundation for African Americans. But the promise was soon to become collateral damage of Lincoln's assassination. When Andrew Johnson took the oath of office in the spring of 1865, Congress was about to adjourn for the summer. In their absence, he began implementing his own version of Reconstruction, dismantling some of Lincoln's efforts in the process. He officially revoked Sherman's land order and restored the titles of Southern plantations to their white, former Confederate owners. Johnson offered amnesty for any Confederate leader who swore an oath of future loyalty to the United States. Former Confederates could even hold political office under Johnson's plan. Freed blacks were left with nothing. Johnson also paved the path for speedy re-entry of Southern states into the Union. Johnson's only real stipulation was that the states ratify the 13th Amendment. Johnson's home state of Tennessee became the first state readmitted under this framework in 1866. But the radicals in Congress would not sit idly by as Johnson orchestrated Reconstruction by himself. When they returned to the Capitol, they took swift action to handcuff his efforts and implement their own Reconstruction policies. This is our fourth big idea. Radical Republicans in Congress wrestled control of Reconstruction from President Johnson. Their policies focused on civil rights legislation, military occupation, and constitutional amendments. When the new congressional session began and more radical Republicans were seated, an intense conflict emerged between the conservative president and the radical Congress. The radicals' first priority was to pass legislation protecting newly freed African Americans, which Johnson opposed. Beginning in 1865, Congress passed laws establishing and empowering the Freedmen's Bureau, a new department of the executive branch that was dedicated to the service of newly freed African Americans in the South. The Bureau provided education by setting up black schools, helped African Americans locate displaced family members that had been sold away, and even assisted in job placement. President Johnson opposed the Freedmen's Bureau and vetoed it, but radical Republicans in Congress passed the law again, overriding the president's veto. But the Freedmen's Bureau saw only mixed success. While it did provide much-needed services, Johnson undermined the organization by firing many of its staff and refusing to replace them. Over time, the Bureau became ineffectual and corrupt, enraging the radicals in Congress. In 1866, Congress passed a law aimed at codifying racial equality. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 redefined citizenship to include the formerly enslaved and guaranteed equal treatment under the law for African Americans. Johnson again vetoed the bill, but Congress again passed it over his objection. The political vitriol between Johnson and radical Republicans in Congress was so intense that the radicals attempted to remove the president through impeachment in 1868. By a single vote, Johnson was acquitted in the Senate, but the veto overrides and impeachment effort crippled him politically. Neither party nominated him for re-election in 1868. In 1867, Republicans in Congress, furious with Johnson's refusal to enforce their Reconstruction policies, turned to new methods. The Military Reconstruction Act, passed in March 1867, divided the South into 5 military districts, each to be commanded by a former Union general and occupied by the United States Army. The commanding general of each district had absolute law enforcement power. The Military Reconstruction Act also dictated additional requirements for Southern states to officially rejoin the Union, which included the drafting of a new state constitution and the ratification of the 13th and 14th Amendments. In addition to military occupation, Congress looked to other methods to ensure the posterity of civil rights and racial equality. These efforts culminated with 3 constitutional amendments, known as the Civil War or Reconstruction Amendments. Together, they represent the closest thing we have to a peace treaty for the Civil War, one that the South was forced to accept. Now, we already know about the 13th Amendment. It was passed early in 1865, before the war officially ended. The 13th Amendment ended slavery in the United States for all coming time. The following year, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which extended citizenship to all natural-born and naturalized persons, regardless of race. The 14th Amendment overturned the Dred Scott decision of 10 years prior and held that African Americans would be equal in the eyes of the law. In 1870, the 15th Amendment became the final Reconstruction Amendment. It held that no citizen may be denied the right to vote based on race, color, or prior condition of servitude. The intent of this amendment was to extend voting rights to African Americans throughout the country. The passage and ratification of these Reconstruction Amendments was the crowning achievement of radical Republicans during the Reconstruction period. But as we'll see next time, they were not perfect, nor were they always effectively enforced. After 1870, Reconstruction efforts continued for another 6 years under the frameworks provided by the Military Reconstruction Act and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But the South found a variety of ways to resist these measures, and after a disputed presidential election in 1876, the North agreed to end military occupation and abandon its efforts to reform the South. The North had grown tired of trying to control the South, and zeal for radical republicanism fizzled away. In the next lecture, we'll take a closer look at the South's resistance to Reconstruction and the legacy of this period in American history. But for now, let's revisit today's big question. Was Reconstruction radical or conciliatory? On one hand, the military occupation of the South between 1867 and 1877 was unprecedented. Some freedoms were stripped away from Southern states, but others were codified for African Americans. The Freedmen's Bureau experienced success as a social welfare arm of the federal government, and the Reconstruction Amendments laid critical groundwork for more than a century's worth of progress towards equality. On the other hand, the failure of the government to address economic inequality in the South had far-reaching consequences that persist to this day. The restoration of wealth and property to white former Confederates following the war preserved the antebellum socioeconomic class system, and many of the same political leaders who orchestrated the rebellion found themselves in power once again. The Confederate Vice President, Alexander Stephens, served again in the House of Representatives before being elected governor of Georgia in 1882. And as we'll see, Southern society had changed very little when the North abandoned its Reconstruction efforts. Abraham Lincoln's death remains one of the great what-ifs in American history. What if Congress and the president could have negotiated towards a common goal? What if the executive branch had worked to enforce the will of the people rather than undermine it? What if Lincoln could have led the nation out of the war that he so skillfully saw it through? Sadly, we'll never know. Next time, we'll take a look inside Southern society during the Reconstruction era. See you then.